we can start. Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this webinar organized to launch the research that was published by the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham and by Free the Slaves under the title Modern Slavery and the United Nations Security Council. My name is Dr. Marta Furlan. I'm a Senior Program Manager for Research at Free the Slaves, and I have the honor of being the moderator of today's webinar. On our panel of expert speakers today are Dr. Katarina Schwartz, Dr. Ergul Çeliksoy, who led the research project, and they will guide us through the methodology and the findings, and Mr. Bukeni Waruzi, who will help us to understand how this research can be used to strengthen advocacy efforts on part of organizations such as Free the Slaves. Katarina leads the Rights Lab's Law and Policy Program. Her research interrogates the law and policy frameworks operating at the global, regional, and domestic level to determine the elements of effective anti-slavery governance and to map trends, successes, and failures in this area. Ergul also works as part of the Rights Lab's Law and Policy Program, examining the intersections between modern slavery, criminal justice, and criminal law. He has a background as a qualified Turkish lawyer with a research focus on European and comparative law and policy related to life imprisonment and prisoners' rights. And Bukeni is the executive director of Free the Slaves. For more than 20 years, he has served as a human rights champion with the American, European, and African organizations. Prior to joining Free the Slaves, he worked as senior program manager for Witness in New York and served as executive director of Watchlist in New York. Now, a couple of words on the logistics. We will have first Katarina and Ergul to guide us through the research, and then Bukeni, as I mentioned, will help us to put the research in the context of advocacy efforts. You are welcome to type your questions in the chat box as the speakers give their presentations and remarks, and at the end we will have a 15 minutes time window in which they will be addressing your questions. As mentioned at the beginning, today's webinar is dedicated to the launch of a research report carried out by Rights Lab and Free the Slaves that examines modern slavery as a security concern at the United Nations Security Council. The study explores in particular the intersection between modern slavery, human trafficking, and key UNSC agendas, such as women, peace and security, children and armed conflict, and the protection of civilians in armed conflict. I believe that this research could hardly be any timelier. If we look around us, it is evident that armed conflict and modern slavery are deeply interconnected. In Sudan, where a civil war broke out in April 2023, girls and women in war zones such as Khartoum and Darfur have been subjected to sex trafficking and sexual slavery. Not too far from Sudan, in Yemen, where a conflict has been going on since 2014, tens of thousands of children have been forcibly recruited as soldiers, especially by the Houthi armed group. And again, to bring another example, in the Eastern DRC, the ongoing conflict has been facilitated human trafficking, including sex trafficking, child labor, forced labor, especially among vulnerable and displaced communities. So this intersection between modern slavery and armed conflict seems to indicate that the UN Security Council, in virtue of its unique mandate, should take initiatives to address modern slavery practices in situations of armed conflict. But we will hear now more about this from Katarina and Ergul themselves, who led this research, and they can help us to understand better what actually is the role of the UN Security Council when it comes to modern slavery in war. Katarina and Ergul, thank you so much for being here, and please, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Marta, and thanks to Free the Slaves as well for collaborating with us in this, I think, important and very timely piece of research, which we launched earlier in the year, but are happy now to share with everyone here. And thanks to all of you for being here with us today. I'm going to start us off by situating the research in its context, talking about the motivations and the context in which the research takes place and to which it speaks. And then I'll hand over to Ergul, who will speak in much more detail about the findings and methodology for the project. As you all likely know, slavery and conflict have been interlinked throughout human history. As long as written records go back, we see evidence of the nexus between slavery and conflict. Slavery has been a motivating force driving wars, an intrinsic element of conflict, and a byproduct of conflict, insecurity, and instability through time. These connections have been recognized at every level of policy and practice, including by the UN Security Council, especially since 2015, and its conscious efforts to address trafficking in persons in conflict settings. Slavery is both a direct and an indirect outcome of conflict. In terms of slavery's direct impact from conflict, armed groups, armed forces, and state actors involved in conflicts revert to a range of modern slavery practices, including enslavement, use of child soldiers, sexual slavery, forced labor, forced and fraudulent recruitment, domestic servitude, and forced marriage. And these practices are employed for a range of purposes. Modern slavery practices are used as a tactic of war to destabilize and dislocate communities, to undermine social trust in government, and as part of wider campaigns of genocide and ethnic cleansing. Modern slavery practices are used as a recruitment tool, both through forcible and fraudulent recruitment of fighters into a conflict, but also as a reward or incentive for fighters through forced marriage and sexual enslavement. And modern slavery practices are also used to finance conflicts through the sale of enslaved individuals, exaction of forced labor, and in some cases, revenue generation through taxation of organized crime. And in addition to these direct modern slavery practices taking place in conflict settings, modern slavery practices are also an indirect consequence of conflict. Conflicts create a favorable environment for modern slavery practices to flourish. Degradation in the rule of law facilitates impunity for perpetrators. Forced displacement, lack of humanitarian aid, social fragmentation, and family breakdown create populations extremely vulnerable to exploitation, both as a result of predation and as a result of negative coping mechanisms employed by people placed in desperate situations with very few alternatives. This vulnerability often carries across borders and carries through not only the conflict setting itself, but through the diaspora of people displaced by those conflicts, filtering out through humanitarian settings in contexts of insecurity outside the conflict itself. And this is evident also in the fact that research suggests that 90% of modern wars have involved some form of modern slavery practice. So we know that modern slavery practices are endemic in conflict settings. But despite that clear and recognized connection between slavery and conflict, among the major frames or approaches that we see dominating the anti-slavery and anti-trafficking spaces globally, the security perspective remains relatively nascent. Over the past 30 years or so, we've achieved a fairly significant development of consideration of modern slavery as a criminal justice issue, understanding modern slavery practices as a human rights issue, and understanding modern slavery practices as labor rights issues. And more recently, we've also seen substantial advancement in understanding modern slavery as an issue of economic policy, trade policy, business policy, corporate governance, as well as a sustainable development concern. And yet, we haven't seen a similar level of development in thinking about modern slavery as a peace and security issue, despite how deeply rooted it is in contexts of instability and insecurity. So as we widen our understanding of the issue of modern slavery, it's natural that we would start to think of a wider range of perspectives, because we know, of course, that modern slavery is an intensely intersectional issue. We can map connections between modern slavery and at least 139 of the 169 Sustainable Development Goal targets. And as we recognize that multifaceted, intersectional, and complex nature of the issue of modern slavery, we think it's important to develop an equally multifaceted and intersectional response, which means that every major arena of policy and action to which modern slavery is connected should be considering and mainstreaming modern slavery concerns in its action and in its policies. And that's really where the study comes in, to begin opening more intensive conversation about the best ways to tackle the entire variety and range of modern slavery practices in the context of security, both in conflict settings and in non-conflict security settings. And to begin making that conversation a lot more comprehensive and systematic than it may have been to date. So with that as a kind of grounding introduction, I would like to hand over to Ergul Chaliksoy, who's going to discuss the study, the way that we approached it, and what we found. So Ergul, over to you.
Thank you, Katerina. Thank you, everyone, for joining the webinar today. I see like almost 100 people are in the webinar, which is great to see that like people are really interested in hearing the findings from the research. So I have a presentation to share, and then let me see if I can get it done. Sorry, can you see my screen?
Yes,
we can.
Okay, perfect. So, okay, thank you very much, Katerina. Thank you very much, Martha, for the nice word. So, as Katerina has told about the purpose of the research, so I'll be providing some key findings from the research, but first, I will briefly explain the research methods and how we approach to this project, how we did this research, and how we found our findings from the project. So in this project, we combined 4 streams of research methods to examine the intersection between modern slavery and the Security Council. In this study, we reviewed, coded, and analyzed the references to modern slavery practices across all Security Council documents published from 1990 to 2022, a 32-year time period, and we have looked at all the documents published by the United Nations Security Council in this time frame. In total, we have identified 10,488 documents, and we have reviewed them, we have coded them, and we have analyzed them in the context of modern slavery and armed conflict. We have also conducted a systematic evidence review to analyze the current literature on the intersection between modern slavery and Security Council. And in addition to the document review and the systematic literature review, we have also conducted an in-depth analysis of the various key documents, instruments, and reports. So these included, for example, key thematic resolution of the Security Council, reports of the UN Secretary General, and national action plans on women, peace, and security. And finally, we conducted 10 interviews with the UN system stakeholders who have experience addressing modern slavery practices in settings of conflict or instability. I must admit that this was one of the most challenging tasks for us in this study because people were not keen to participate in the project, especially those who are currently working with the UN institution. But we have managed to have some interviews so that like they are analyzing the report in the final report. So as I was saying, we have looked at the United Nations Security Council documents published from 1990 to 2022 as part of this project. And during this time frame, the Security Council published more than 10,000 documents, 10,488 documents. And these documents were from 9 different document categories as listed in the Security Council's official websites. Namely, these were Security Council's resolution, volumes of resolution, presidential statements, notes by the president, exchange of letters, reports of the Secretary General, annual reports, reports of Security Council missions, and press statements. So as you can see in this slide, the number of documents available in each category varies same as the number of documents containing at least one or more reference to modern slavery practices. If you look at column 1 here, you can see the number of documents from each document category. For example, for the Security Council resolution, you will see 1052 documents. And then in column 2 here, you will see 186 documents. That means that 186 documents out of 1052 resolution contained one or more reference to modern slavery practices, and it goes same as the other document categories. But I'll come back to this point later and break down this data a bit further in this slide. So of these 10,488 documents, 1 in every 7 documents make some reference to at least one modern slavery practices. So references are most common in annual reports, as 58% of which contained at least one reference to modern slavery practices. And this is followed by volumes of resolution, 53% of which contained reference to modern slavery practice as well. And then Secretary General reports and reports of Security Council missions are also relatively likely to include reference to modern slavery practices, with around 1/3 of these documents featured at least one reference to modern slavery practices. On the other hand, modern slavery practices are almost never considered in press statements or notes by the presidents, and seldom appear in exchange of letters or presidential statements. So these data give us some idea about how modern slavery practices are addressed by the Security Council, if they ever, and which sort of policy or policy documents they are being used to address modern slavery practices. So if we move forward, and if we look at the modern slavery practices and the number of references to modern slavery practices, as we can see, Security Council has referred to a wide range of modern slavery practices in its documents, but some specific form of modern slavery practices are significantly more likely to be considered by the Security Council compared to others. For example, use of children in armed conflicts, sexual exploitation, and trafficking are relatively well presented in the Security Council documents, identifying these as the core frames for consideration of modern slavery in the agenda of the Security Council. Across a total of 8,413 references to modern slavery practices in the Security Council documents published in 2022, more than 1/3 of these references were related to use of children in armed conflicts, with more than 2,900 references. Sexual exploitation made up 31% of all references, with more than 2,600 references, and trafficking made up 18% of total references, with more than 1,400 references. So collectively, these 3 modern slavery practices represented 84% of all the references to modern slavery practices by the Security Council over more than 30 years period. So despite their prevalence in armed conflicts, other modern slavery practices are seldom considered in Security Council documents, for example, forced labor or slave trade. So we made a very detailed breakdown and analysis of the reference to modern slavery practices in each document category. So perhaps it would be really useful to refer back to the main research reports, and there you can find more detailed analysis about the modern slavery practices in the Security Council's document. So as part of this project, we specifically focused on women, peace, and security agenda. So the evidence reviewed in this study suggests that some modern slavery practices are disproportionately experienced by women and girls. So the majority of estimated and identified victims of modern slavery practices are women and girls, and exploitation of women and girls are significantly shaped by their gender. For example, women and girls are targeted for sexual exploitation, labor exploitation in domestic service, or forced marriage. Women and girls are used as sex slaves or wages of war in situations where they are considered ineligible for marriage with fighters. So they became particularly vulnerable to sexual and gender-based violence and conflict-related sexual violence in situation of conflicts. Women and girls have also been further victimized by the abuse of some officials working in UN peacekeeping missions. And this last, the last point is very important because, as you can see in this slide, the Security Council has also addressed the sexual exploitation and abuse of women and girls by UN peacekeeping personnel. So although sexual exploitation and abuse is itself a form of conflict-related sexual violence, it has a distinctive character in the sense that it is given a particular attention to the official position of the perpetrator. Sexual exploitation and abuse is distinguished from all other forms of conflict-related sexual violence on the basis of official position of the perpetrator, such as military, police, or civilian member of an international peacekeeping mission. Even though not all sexual exploitation and abuse constitute modern slavery practices, especially sexual exploitation has a clear overlap because with clear overlap particularly with human trafficking, which also includes sexual exploitation among its elements. So the Security Council addressed sexual exploitation and abuse in 5 out of 10 resolutions on women, peace, and security, mandating the enforcement of zero tolerance on sexual exploitation and abuse. Peacekeeping personnel are required to refrain from engaging in any actual or attempted abuse of a position of vulnerability, differential power, or trust for sexual purposes. The Security Council also requires that troop and police contributing countries should take preventive and investigative actions to ensure full accountability in the occurrence of sexual exploitation and abuse by UN peacekeeping missions. So again, link back to the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Since 2000, the Security Council has adopted 10 resolutions on women, peace, and security, recognizing the unique and disproportionate impact of conflicts on women and girls. So member states hold the primary responsibility for implementation of the Security Council's resolution on women, peace, and security. And in practice, member states are required or expected to develop their own national action plans to effectively implement women, peace, and security resolution in their domestic jurisdiction. So in 2005, Denmark became the first country adopting a national action plan for the implementation of Security Council's resolution. Since then, we have 103 UN member states and 8 regional and sub-regional organizations which adopted a national action plan to implement the resolution on women, peace, and security. Of these 103 national action plans adopted by UN member states, 70 national action plans, which is 72% of all national action plans adopted by UN member states, recognize a specific role of civil society organizations in implementation of women, peace, and security agenda at domestic and local levels. And 35 national action plans, only 35 national action plans provide an allocated budget for the implementation. So for the purpose of this study, all 111 national action plans on women, peace, and security adopted by UN member states and regional and sub-regional organizations, we have reviewed them all for explicit reference to modern slavery practices to understand how modern slavery practices are addressed in the national action plans on women, peace, and security. So of these 111 national action plans examined, 85 included reference to one or more modern slavery practices. So this included reference to modern slavery, slavery, forced labor, human trafficking, servitude, sexual exploitation, forced marriage, worse forms of child labor, use of children in armed conflicts, and forced recruitment into armed conflict. This is for adults. However, in none of these national action plans, there was any reference to debt bondage. So national action plans are more concentrated in Europe, as you can see, and Africa with 42 and 33 national action plans respectively. So I'm not going to go into much details here. I don't know. I just want to be mindful about time. I think we have still time, so I can go a bit more detail here. So European national action plans were most likely to have the reference to modern slavery practices, with 93% of the national action plans in Europe considered modern slavery at least once. And only 3 of the 42 national action plans adopted by countries and regional and sub-regional organizations in Europe, only 3 of them, Armenia, France, and Latvia, didn't include any references to modern slavery practice at all. So the proportion of national action plans reference to modern slavery practices was also high in Americas, with 89% of national action plans in this region included at least one reference. So a total of 9 national action plans were adopted in Americas. Only one, which is Paraguay, didn't include any reference to modern slavery practices. And in Asia and Pacific, 71% of national action plans reference to modern slavery practices, as do 70% of African national action plans, and national action plans in Middle East and North America were the least likely to have reference to modern slavery practices. So in the national action plans, sexual exploitation and human trafficking were the most commonly referenced modern slavery practices. Of the 85 national action plans, including reference to modern slavery practices, 81 of them reference to sexual exploitation, and this was followed by human trafficking referenced in 65 national action plans. So if we move forward, as you can see, as I was telling earlier, we also look at the children and armed conflict agenda of the United Nations Security Council to understand the link to modern slavery practices. So far, the Security Council has adopted 11 resolutions on children and armed conflict in order to address specific needs and vulnerability of children in situation of armed conflict. So the UN Secretary General addresses 6 grave violations, as you can see in the slide, in its reports on children and armed conflict. And these 6 grave violations are killing and maiming, recruitment or use of children in armed forces, rape or other grave violations, adoption of children, attacks on schools or hospitals, or denial of humanitarian access for children. So, except for the denial of humanitarian access for children, all other grave violations against children trigger the listing of parties to armed conflicts in the annexes of annual reports of the UN Secretary General on children and armed conflict. So this is something important because it puts pressure on the parties to the conflict to refrain from engaging in these 6 grave violations or 5 grave violations, which are listed in the Secretary General reports. So, but as you can see, neither modern slavery nor human trafficking are listed as one of these 6 grave violations against children committed in situation of armed conflict. However, if we look closer, we can see that these 6 grave violations are closely linked to modern slavery practices because the acts constituting of these violations may also amount to human trafficking. For example, if we look at the recruitment and use of children in armed conflicts, we can see that it is a form of human trafficking because both the act, which is recruitment, and the purpose, which is exploitation, are also element of both this grave violation and human trafficking. And if we also look at the rape or other form of sexual violence against children, we can see that these may also constitute human trafficking because these acts are generally committed by armed groups for the purpose of sexual exploitation, as I was telling you earlier. And similarly, abduction of children in armed conflicts may also amount to human trafficking if it is committed for exploitative purposes. So if we move forward, this slide shows the number of children affected by 6 grave violations in armed conflict situation as verified in 2021. So each year, basically, this data came from the Secretary General's reports, and Secretary General published reports in different contexts and annual reports. So these data just verified in 2021, but this can be expand in previous years as well, but we didn't have the time and resources to look at all the reports for each year. So as you can see here, killing and maiming was the most extensively committed violation verified in 2021, affecting more than 7,800 children. And this was followed by recruitment and use of children in armed conflict, affecting more than 4,800 children. So a total of 3,900 children were denied access to humanitarian aid, while 2,900 children were abducted during armed conflict. Rape and other forms of sexual violence were inflicted upon more than 1,100 children, and there were more than 800 children affected by attacks on schools and hospitals. So this is the geographic distribution of the 6 grave violations against children in armed conflict. And as you can see here, basically children are mostly affected by the areas where there's an ongoing conflict, right? So let's move on. And finally, we have also analyzed the Security Council's agenda on protection of children in armed conflict to see if there's an intersection between modern slavery and this specific agenda. Because conflict creates fertile environment for the subject of civilians into modern slavery practices, both directly by armed forces or armed groups or state actors involved in conflicts, or indirectly as traffickers take advantage of degrading in the rule of law and people become more vulnerable. Since 1999, the Security Council has adopted 8 thematic resolutions on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. However, although the Security Council addressed the impact of conflicts on civilian population, it hasn't yet made any clear and explicit connection to modern slavery practices in its agenda on protection of civilian in armed conflict. So I'll stop here. I highly recommend you check both the summary report and actual research report for a more detailed analysis of our findings. As I was saying that we have the breakdown of each data in the main report. I think it will be very useful. I'll now hand over Katarina. She's gonna talk about the research recommendation.
Thanks, Ergo. And I think it's useful just to ground the 2 pieces of information that we've just highlighted together, which is to say that the interconnections between modern slavery and contexts are so deep and so interconnected that 90% of modern wars have evidence of modern slavery practices, and yet only 14% of Security Council documents engage seriously with this issue. And then even then, many of those documents are only engaging in a very limited or light touch way. So what we're seeing is a kind of lack of correlation between the intensity of the problem in the settings in which the UN Security Council is operating, into which it is responding, and the intensity of consideration of modern slavery practices across the relevant agendas. And I think the protection of civilians in armed conflicts is a particularly glaring example of this, because the issue has never been really seriously engaged. And so the report at the conclusion makes a series of recommendations specifically for the UN Security Council and UN member states that are engaged in that. And I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail on these recommendations. You can obviously find them in the report. But I do also want to flag that while the report focuses on implications for the Security Council and associated member states, there are also wider implications for research, advocacy, policy work happening outside of the specific UN Security Council and member states context that we address in the report. So although we focus on those contexts in framing the recommendation, we think there are a lot more general, wider implications of the research for other actions to take this seriously in the context of peace and security broadly, and to think about how to take this work forward. And Ergo hinted that there were a number of areas of research that require further interrogation, further analysis, deeper analysis. We really think that this study is just scratching the surface of some of these issues and highlighting a direction of travel for future research. But in saying that, I think it's important to highlight that the full report especially is a really useful reference guide as we proceed with thinking about modern slavery practices in the context of the UN Security Council, not only because of the substantive analysis and findings that it presents, but also because of the way that it marshals, synthesizes, summarizes, and presents that evidence in the longer version of the report. So it includes things like brief summaries of all of the relevant UN Security Council resolutions that address modern slavery practices. So you can immediately run through where and how the UN Security Council resolutions have grappled with modern slavery practices without having to do what we did, which is trawl through 10,000 UN Security Council documents. So we effectively hope we've given everyone a jump start on assessing how the UN Security Council is grappling with this issue and made that a lot easier, because some of the documents are long and dense and some of them are not even relevant at all. So we've hopefully narrowed your frame of reference. But then back to the recommendations. Firstly, to note, and I think this came particularly strongly through in the interviewees' responses, that there's a need for the Security Council to engage with modern slavery practices in the context of conflict, yes, because conflict settings are a significant breeding ground for modern slavery practices, but also as a wider threat to international peace and security, and to consider risks and security risks of modern slavery practices in the contexts that have flown on from trafficking through displacement and through regional insecurity, but also through other contexts of instability and insecurity that aren't active conflict zones. There's also, I think, an emphasis, despite the fact that we're talking about the security frame, on taking an integrated approach to thinking about the different frames for tackling modern slavery together. So one of the recommendations, therefore, is that the UN Security Council should not only think in terms of peace and security as a frame, but also take a human rights-based approach within that context and integrate the other frames together. And that flows through again to this idea that the security setting doesn't work in isolation, and policy and action that takes place within a security context also doesn't exist in isolation. And so it's important that those integrated efforts work across all the UN Security Council's agendas, that we're not just seeing modern slavery concerns in the women, peace and security agenda, but never in the protection of civilians in armed conflict, but that's mainstreamed across agendas, and that there's a consideration for coordination and cooperation with other modern slavery responses and mechanisms outside of the security context. There is a real emphasis, I would say, again, especially in the stakeholder interviews, on the need for the policy to translate into action on the ground. That the commitments in the policy documents are all well and good, and it's important to see these commitments and to see these issues reflected in policy, and that does have a catalyzing effect on stakeholders on the ground, but there's a need for greater emphasis on the implementation of those policies on the ground. And then in a slightly more technical light, there's consideration around the use of Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter to create binding resolutions for the UN Security Council. If you want to jump to the next slide, Virgil. Again, I would say one of the key takeaways from this report is the importance of a more comprehensive and systematic approach to mainstreaming tackling modern slavery across different aspects of peace and security policies and activities. There's a need for awareness raising on those issues at the global level, and integration and mainstreaming across different responses. There's also a suggestion here that the UN Security Council should consider invoking the jurisprudence of the International Criminal Court to prosecute perpetrators of modern slavery practices where they amount to crime against humanity or war crimes. That's a pretty specific recommendation tied to this context. And then more broadly, in the context of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, there's a need for more comprehensive tackling of modern slavery practices there, including in the national action plans that Ergel was speaking about. Also important in the context of the Children in Armed Conflicts agenda, there's a recommendation that the Security Council consider recognizing modern slavery practices as a grave violation against children in armed conflicts per se, rather than having these piecemeal and clear connections, but not in a comprehensive and systematic way. And lastly, I think it's important to again emphasize consensus building, cooperation, and joint efforts to develop a unified approach to addressing modern slavery practices in conflict and security settings. There is clear efforts to engage with modern slavery practices in the context of UN Security Council policy, but those efforts are not comprehensive, not systematic, and don't engage with the full range of violations that occur in conflict settings or in non-conflict insecurity settings. So it's important that there's just a more comprehensive and systematic approach to dealing with these practices as we move forward to kind of mainstreaming modern slavery or anti-slavery concerns in the security agenda. And so I think that's a nice way to round out this, because really we see this as the start of a much larger research agenda on modern slavery and conflict and security settings, and this kind of opening up of a wider conversation around the best ways for security actors, both the UN Security Council and other security actors outside of the UN Security Council, to really seriously engage with the topic and think about how to tackle this very historic and ongoing challenge. And I think with that, I'm going to close out our session and hand over, I believe, to Bukeni, although maybe I'm handing back to Marta to introduce Bukeni.
Thank you so much, Katerina and Ergel, for this fascinating and engaging presentation of your research methods and findings. And as Katerina said, Bukeni, please, the floor is yours. We are looking forward to hearing more from your perspective on how this research can be used for advocacy efforts.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Marta, for the great moderation, and especially special thanks to Katerina and Ergel for the wonderful presentation laying out the contours of the research, from the process to methodology to the deliverables. I mean, I think as an advocate, I think I want to maybe focus on sharing some ideas on maybe 2 or 3 main points. I mean, one question one may ask is, what is this research meant for? That's one. And then really second, how receptive can the Security Council, which is a political institution, willing to take on this as you know, I mean, as much as important it can be, will this work? And then 3, I wanted to would also discuss a little bit in terms of what next. Now, we all know that, you know, Security Council resolutions are binding. It is very important, and as you know, initially, just to give you a little background, is that when we're thinking about this project, the idea was out of many options there, many efforts that are done at regional level and also global level, why haven't we seen a unified and binding or more kind of a straightforward political will to end this? We all acknowledge how difficult it is and how important it is at the same time to address the issue of modern slavery in communities, countries, communities, and survivors. Everyone is trying to find how can we address this. It's not because it's modern that means it hasn't existed before. It is just, it has existed for years. It just has changed shapes and forms and scope. Now, to get to this point, it was very necessary to try to see how we can bring this issue in the eyes of the Security Council. He has already taken a few things to address this. As you have seen from Ego's presentation, that there has been mention of this issue here and there in different resolutions, in presidential statements, etc., etc. But we haven't really seen a decisive action taken at the council level. But why the Security Council? Is simply because the power that has the Security Council to make things work will also benefit this kind of issue in a way that is tremendous. Understand, we are struggling to end this. Every single year, there are more people affected directly or indirectly by this issue. And every year we hear politicians, practitioners, researchers coming up with new data, politicians' new statements, how they are determined. We are also hearing communities kind of raising their voices, how reminding us how they are suffering. We are hearing with people from persons with lived experiences or survivors, calling each and everyone to do whatever they can to end this. So there has been push to end this. However, we need to take this to the highest level. I understand in different resolutions, there have been really clear mention of human trafficking or these kind of issues that pertain to modern and slavery, but we haven't seen. And we want this similar political will that has shown, that the Security Council has shown in other areas pertaining to peace and security agendas, as Ergo have really highlighted them. The WPS, the Women, Peace and Security, the Children and Armed Conflict, protection of civilians, etc. These are key agendas that, as they have demonstrated, there is no way you can tackle them without mentioning, more than slavery as one of the biggest issues. Now, why also the Security Council should take this also is because not only because of its binding the binding nature of the resolution, but also what we have seen, the progress made in other peace and security agendas are very encouraging and inspiring, and really calls for really a comprehensive integration of these other issues that can benefit from those progress. Now, that's why bringing this into the eyes of the Security Council is really the work of activists, is really the work of researchers, is really the work of NGOs that we are to bring these issues to the eyes of the most powerful, to really making sure they can be addressed. And once are addressed, then they will ease the suffering of kind of millions of people, both women and children were most affected, but also men as well. And not addressing this is costing, all the efforts in terms of the development, at national level, at regional level, but also, and most importantly, at community level. Now, that takes me to the other point that I kind of try to kind of think through is really to think through these kind of issues and the involvement of Security Council. The idea is not to create a new agenda. The idea is how to have kind of a complementarity within these agendas, as they have as Ergo and Katarina have demonstrated, that they are present in all of these agendas. They are present in all of these major agendas that are at the heart or at the table of the Security Council. Now, why, how can we bring also this to complement this effort as they are doing on? We know at country level, millions of dollars are being spent. But also we know at global level, political will is tough. We have seen here and there. We have really enjoyed good speeches, good statements, beautiful ones, but we haven't really seen really much of the progress made toward this, despite clear statements that are done through the SDG 8.7 that calls for the eradication of forced labor, human trafficking, modern slavery, and child labor. Now, as advocates, why this is important for us to bring to this highest level? I know that really there are many activities going on as a result of initiatives from the Security Council. Ergo have talked about action plans, on children armed conflict or child soldiers, or sexual violence in conflict. And countries, or let's say state and non-state parties, have been quite serious about going, about really materializing what they commit to do during these action plans. And we know there are consequences when you say something and you don't do it. So we believe that bringing this to the table of the Security Council will really make a real progress that we haven't seen before. Why we haven't seen? Because we are still looking for the highest body to take this as a serious agenda, because it has done so in other frameworks or agenda. And as advocates, I think that is our role. That is our role. That is our work, is to make sure we can awaken the Security Council, and they are always open. They are always receptive to take on some of the issues as they affect millions of people, and they can harm what is being done in terms of progress toward peace and security around the world. Now, I know I have to conclude in a few minutes, but I want also to say where we go from this. What do we want now the Security Council to do? I know it is not easy. I know it is a process. But as advocates, we want to cooperate with some of the member states, especially those among the P5, to at least start a process that will kind of galvanize the Security Council to around this issue. And that starts with organizing initiatives such as an area formula. This could be something that we can see how we can have member states really make some pronouncements on this issue, as it is very important. And then we can move toward whatever it might be in a few years from now. Why not a resolution? That is the ultimate goal that we have, to get to a point where we can have a resolution that will help integrate the issue into other peace and security agenda of the Security Council. I know some of you might be skeptical how this will be. We believe in our action. We believe that if we are able to make a good case, I believe we can get the Security Council full attention and can take on this. From Free the Slave side, I want to say really thank you to all of you. And I think the next step is, we are working on a follow-up research with the Security Council members to come up with another one, and then work with one of the P5 to organize an area formula on this issue. And likely, inshallah, if everything goes well, a few years from now, to get to a resolution or a presidential statement, and also making sure that in the Security Council, in the UN Secretary General report, can also have a framework where he will also report on modern slavery as it pertains to peace and security. So I will end there and handle and really turn back to you, Dr. Marta. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bukeni. This was an extremely helpful intervention to understand a bit better what are the next steps that, as a coalition of people working in this space, we can take. Now, in the few minutes that we have left, we can take some of the questions that the participants have put in the chat. First question, what comprehensive strategies can the United Nations implement to eradicate modern slavery, and how can it ensure collaboration between international governments, businesses, and survivor networks to address the root causes and the systemic factors that are perpetuating human trafficking, forced labor, and different manifestations of modern slavery. I would ask the three of you, Bukeni, Katarina, and Arguli, for the sake of time, you can keep your answers concise. Thank you.
Katarina, would you like to get that question?
I'm wondering if Bukini wants to start on this one.
Yeah.
I feel like this is the actual crux of the entire purpose of the work. So it's a very incisive question. But Bukini, do you want to share your thoughts?
Yes, happy to take on that. I think here, what Mr. Philip, if I pronounce well, is asking for what kind of a multi-stakeholder cooperation that need to happen to make this materialize. I know there are few frameworks, there are few initiatives, including the Alliance 8.7, that is a partnership between governments and civil society organizations, UNAA agencies, survivors, etc., to really come together to see how they can make progress towards ending this issue by 2030. Of course, one of the promise was to end child labor by 2025. Of course, I hope the next year we say we have ended it. But anyway, so those that is one example. Another example is, when you can see how some of the bureaus or initiatives within the United Nations itself, with kind of special rapporteurs, kind of special or representative of Secretary General, or that are in countries, but also are tasked or are looking on these very issues. So those are kind of examples that you can see, but the problem is, how do we participate in those frameworks? And as we participate in those frameworks, how determined we are, in really having a common goal, and in order to achieve the desired result. I know you and I know very well, and all of us, that modern slavery is not a hazard of things. It is intentional. People that kind of exploiting other people is by intention. And so that is a crime. And you also have other mechanisms. Katarina talks about the ICC, the Rome Statute of the ICC. We know that trafficking in person is a crime against humanity under the Article 7 of the Rome Statute. However, I have yet to see who's the criminal who's been brought to the ICC and charged for trafficking. So even though in the Rome Statute, trafficking is not very well defined in itself, but there are elements of trafficking that fit into the Article 7 of the Rome Statute. So there are quite a variety of mechanisms in which we can look at as we try to interact. But really, as you say, it is about a multi-stakeholder engagement approach, and to make sure we have a common goal for desired result.
Katarina and Arguli, is there anything that you would like to add to what Bukeni has been saying?
I think that's fairly comprehensive, and I'm conscious of time, but I think that also responds to the question in the Q&A that's posted in French about how do you manage to prevent modern slavery in contexts where armed groups make the law. And I just wanted to comment that I think these cases are exactly why an integrated and intersectional approach is necessary, because it's not enough to just deal with a criminal justice response around the edges of the problem. Modern slavery concerns need to be mainstreamed across the humanitarian policy, dealing with the displacement that's happening in that same region to avoid the modern slavery risk among those displaced populations. It needs to be integrated into the immigration and migration policy along the routes that people are traveling after they're displaced and in ultimate destination countries to prevent that risk. And it needs to be built into wider security programming and rule of law programming and stability programming. So it's a really complicated problem, and I think that just speaks to the need for this really integrated and strategic response across different aspects of policy and programming globally and in context.
Thank you, Katarina. And perhaps we can take a very final question before we have to wrap up the webinar. A participant is asking about the role that the EU's corporate due diligence regulations or other emerging mandatory human rights regulations can help to drive better integration of human rights due diligence within the UN Security Council.
I think this is a really challenging question and not one that any of us would have necessarily anticipated today. I think there are probably two aspects of this that are interesting very briefly. The first is the role of corporations, and particularly multinational corporations, in settings of instability and conflict, because it's not the case that multinational corporations aren't present, aren't operating in any of these contexts of instability and conflict, and may actually have roles to play in shaping the conflict and instability themselves, as well as the ongoing impact of extractive industry in economies and in contexts in which that instability is playing. So I think there's an element of the human rights due diligence frame that may help to think about the role of these companies in those settings and require a greater level of action to mitigate the modern slavery risks that are existing there. Because it's not the case that those corporations are distinct from or completely separate from conflict and instability that might be happening in these contexts. And I think the other aspect works the other way, is there something that security actors can learn from due diligence? And absolutely there's a need for greater attention and training for military personnel, for security personnel that are operating in these contexts, because we have seen, as Erbil highlighted, exploitation and abuse committed by peacekeepers, committed by humanitarian actors in these kinds of settings. And it's really on the security agencies and security organizations to be actively and diligently working to mitigate those risks down their operations. And so I think there's something about downstream operational management that maybe can be learned from very good supply chain management there. But it's really, those are some nascent thoughts, because I don't think any of us would have expected that question.
Thank you, Katarina. Ergul, Bukeni, any final thought that you would like to contribute before we have to close?
No, I think we are good.
Thank you.
Bukeni,
from your side?
Yeah, I think for me, there was quite one small question in terms of, you know, in the TIP report, a country was in tier 2, but now has been degraded into tier 2 at least. What can we do to push government to more? I think that is quite a very interesting, you know, question. Of course, no one will know what country is that. So, but if I think there will be more detail, could have provided kind of very specific ideas in terms of how to work with government to improve its record, you know, with regard not only to TIP report but others. So, yeah, so that's what I would say. But really, I want to really say thank you so much. Nothing to add. Brilliant presentations. Reach out to us if you need anything. We're happy to continue the discussions, but we will be happy to take these discussions at the Security Council. I know it is a process. It doesn't come out of, you know, a magic button, but I think, you know, we will get there. We're going to work for the slaves. Is the determined to work to make sure that we can bring this discussion at the Security Council. And we know there are many countries that are very receptive to this kind of issues and are willing really to work with us. So we'll continue to work with these partners to make sure we can really bring these discussions to the core of the Security Council. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bukeni. It was a wonderful way to conclude our webinar of today. Once again, on behalf of Free the Slaves, on behalf of the Rights Lab at University of Nottingham, thank you to all of you for being part of this webinar, for engaging with us, for sharing your thoughts, comments, and questions. I remind you that, as was mentioned throughout the presentation, the report and the executive summary are available online, so you're free to download and then dive deeper into them. And this webinar was recorded and is available on YouTube, so you can rewatch it, share the link with your colleagues, with your teams, and we're looking forward to further engagement with you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you,
Okay,
everyone.
bye-bye.
Thanks.